G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds everyone well. Just wanted to show a few examples of using Curve's adjustment layer with image editing today. It's a fantastic tool that gives you a lot of flexibility and has a lot of built-in tools to really make your image editing process quick and easy, as well as having a lot of control over various parts of the image, both from a color and contrast and brightness or luminosity perspective. Let's get straight into it. So I just have an image here that I photographed on the Gold Coast. It was a beautiful day. This was shot in winter, which is a fairly typical day for winter. So absolutely a beautiful place to be. Firstly, I'm just going to actually clean up the image. There's just a couple of dust spots that I want to take care of that have been bugging me a little bit. So this image was shot with a Canon SLR, and I clearly needed to have the image sensor cleaned. So I'm just using the spot healing brush there, shortcuts J, and that's certainly for dust spots on a sky, a quick and easy way to get rid of them. So with using curves as an adjustment tool for image editing, you can apply a curve directly to the image itself, and that's just a case of adjustments and curves. So image adjustments and curves. So that definitely gives you the option, all the options that applying a curves adjustment gives you. The only downside is once it's applied to the image, it's applied to the image. So I always recommend in Photoshop to use layer adjustments, as it's non-destructive. You can save it as a PSD or a TIFF with the layer intact, so you can shut the image down and reopen it later for continual editing. As well as there's a few options in the way that layers interact with the image that you have, which we'll go through today. So as you can see, I've applied that curve directly to the image itself, but what I want to do is actually apply it as a layer. There's a couple of ways you can do that. So the first way is to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and Curves. That just means that when I apply that curve, it becomes a layer on top of the image, which you can see there down in the layers panel, down on the bottom right hand side. The curve is still there, so I've got all the options for editing, but it also means that now it's a layer rather than being applied directly to the image itself. The other way that you can do that is through the adjustments panel, which I have open here just above the layers panel, and you can see the top middle one there is curves. Now if you can't see the adjustments panel, you just need to go up to Window and Adjustments. If I turn that off, you can see it disappears, and I'll click that again so we see the little tick next to it and the adjustments layer panel pops up. So literally all we need to do there is click on the layers and it applies, click on the curves and it applies a curves adjustment layer directly above the image there. So that's quick and easy, and certainly a great way to create that curves adjustment layer directly above the image itself. Now, the first thing that I just want to go through is how that layer interacts with the layers below. Now, currently we've only got the background layer, which is the image itself. However, if you have a look down here on the bottom of the properties of the curves adjustment layer, you can see that this adjustment affects all layers below. Now, it's a little square with a arrow that comes out from the left hand side and points down. Now if I click on that, it means that that curves adjustment layer only affects the image directly below. So if we had, for example, several images or several adjustments as part of this image, say if there were 3 or 4 layers of various images that I'm using to create this image, by clicking on that box and not having the line go through it, it means that the adjustment that I'm making, or the edit that I'm making with this curves adjustment layer, is only affecting the image directly below it. So that's worth considering, because it does, when you get into more complex edits with multiple layers, it does give you a little bit more flexibility on how that curve interacts with all of the layers that make up the image that you may be working on. So just a bit of food for thought there. So firstly, what we're going to do is just make some adjustments to this curves adjustment layer and just have a look at what effect it has on the image. So if we come in, we can see we've just got a straight line from the bottom left to the top right. If I click in the middle there, you can see there's now what's called a control point. And that control point is active because it's completely filled in. If I make another control point, you can see now the second control point is filled in, the first one is hollow in the center. That means that it's not active. So I'll just get rid of that second control point because I only want to work on the one control point to begin with. So again, you can see it's still not active. So if I click on that control point, it becomes filled and it becomes active again. Now, to start with, just a basic curve, if I click on that control point and move up towards the top left, you can see I'm increasing the exposure or the brightness of the image. And if I pull it down to the bottom right, you can see I'm decreasing the exposure or brightness to the image. If I take that back to the center roughly and I then hit delete, I can delete that particular control point and we're back to where we begin. Now if I make a control point down at the bottom part of the curve and I drop that down, you can see it actually is changing the shape of the curve. It's actually giving more weight towards the bottom left hand side of the curve and the left hand side of the histogram, which we all know equates for the shadow area. Same if I push it up, again the shape of the curve is not similar to the one that we had earlier and it gives more weight to the shadow area. So again, if I make sure that that control point is highlighted and hit delete, it will delete that control point and we're back to the beginning. Same if we go up in the top right hand corner, this is handling more of the highlights. If I increase and decrease the highlights there, it reduces the exposure or drops the exposure down to make the image darker. Now, keeping in mind that once I make a control point, I can actually select and drag that control point to any part of the image. So if you start the control point on the top right hand side and you decide you want it on the bottom left hand side, you can absolutely do that, or even in the center. It's entirely up to you. We can also have more than one control point. So if I want a control point in the shadow areas or the bottom left hand side and a control point in the highlight areas, I can lock off the shadow areas by keeping that control point where it is and only affecting the highlights, either increasing or decreasing exposure. Now what that does is it now creates a bit of an S-curve, as you can see by the shape. Now if I have an S-curve in this shape where I'm increasing the highlights and decreasing the shadows, I'm also increasing contrast. If I increase the shadows and decrease the highlights, I'm reducing contrast. So you can start to see with the curves the incredible amount of flexibility that it offers in terms of how your image looks. If I decrease everything, then the whole image becomes darker. If I increase both those control points, then the whole image becomes brighter. But you can see that with a very subtle curve, you have control over the amount of contrast that you're creating. So a very effective tool to be able to create and control that contrast. Let's just remove those control points. I'm going to drag them into each corner, another method of removing them. And I'm going to, you can see on the curve, there's already control points in the top right hand and bottom left hand corner. And I'm going to click and I'm going to drag those. So you've actually got control over how those curves look by using those two end control points. So there's a lot of flexibility there. I'll take that back to the top right hand corner and we'll do the same with the shadow or the bottom left hand corner. So quite a bit of flexibility there around using those control points that already exist in the corners to have effects on your images. Now, you can see also with curves how quickly the adjustment affects the image. It really is quite a quick effect. And if we look at just going in and creating a little bit of contrast in the image, you can see that it doesn't take a lot to increase that contrast. So you do want to be very careful with how you apply curves adjustments to images, as it doesn't take a great deal to see a great effect. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Let's remove those control points, drag those into the corners, and we're back to the very beginning and our original image. You can see that we've got a number of other options in the curves adjustment. Up until now, we've only just applied control points and adjustments to the curve itself. But you can see that there's a number of other options. If we just click Auto, then Photoshop's going to create a suggested curve, very similar to what we did just before, around just increasing the contrast and the kind of punchiness of the image. And that's a great way to start, just to see what Photoshop thinks is ideal. But of course, even though you've selected Auto and Photoshop's done the job for you, you can still make adjustments to that curve if you like, including removing those control points. If we have a look at the presets, we've got a number of presets there that give us options to look at what they do for us. So if we just have a look at cross process, for example, you can see that it gives us a really out there kind of look, very similar to the old cross processing that you would see in film days. So that's a great option to look at, and a number of other options that certainly give us some interesting results. So as you can see, there's definitely options that are available to as presets that give you some really different results, or at the very least, they're just starting points for you to see what results you're going to get, and then of course you can build on them. So very interesting indeed. So we'll just go back to the default, and what we can also do is under the little tab there that starts with RGB is you can start to affect the individual color channels like red, green and blue, which of course is the basis for the images in a digital space, and you can make any adjustments that you want to make from the very go. You can see down the bottom there as well, there's a little reset button that I've just clicked on, and that resets to the adjustment default, as you can see when I hover over there. So that gives you the option to go back to the very beginning if you want. Looking at some of the other tools just on the left hand side here, with this top one you can actually click on and drag on the image itself to modify the curve as that text states. So for example, if we click on certain parts of the image, you can see that those control points are updating as I do that, and it allows you to click and drag on different parts of the image and get some interesting effects. So these other tools that you can see on the left hand side there, I'll just hover over them so you can see the text. Sample in image to set the black point, sample in image to set grey point, and sample in image to set white point. These are particularly handy. I mean, you can absolutely use them on any image, but particularly handy if you use a reference card that has a specific black, grey and white amount that you've photographed as part of a scene. This would be particularly handy if you're photographing products in a commercial sense, where color balance and tonal range, texture and contrast needs to be absolutely accurate. So if I just, as an example, sample image to set grey point, it's going to give me some out there sort of results, because we don't actually have a specific grey reference within the image. What we can do though is select the white point just on one of these buildings. Now this won't be perfectly white, but let's just see what it does, just to give us a result. Let's reset that. Let's go to the white part of the image. So it's not actually seeing, I mean, that part of the building there that I've just clicked on is probably the closest to a white point that we're going to get. If I just click on that there, it really doesn't do much to the image at all. But you can see the point that I'm making. If you have one of those reference cards in an image, you can set the black, grey and white point, which is the starting point of your image editing process. Otherwise, the default use of the curves adjustment layer is the one that I'm hovering over at the moment, which is edit points to modify the curve, as the text says. So that was the original process that I showed you, where selecting those control points and making the image adjustments per se. This is a handy little tool as well, where you can actually draw the curve onto the curve itself. So interesting. If you just click and drag into an SCurve as an example, you're actually drawing the curve almost freehand, I guess you could describe it. That's kind of interesting approach. You're certainly taking a more freehand approach, I guess, for want of better words. The nice thing there is you can draw a sort of curve to begin with and then go back to those control points, and it will actually put control points in place so that you can further edit or remove that curve to get it closer to a point where you're happy. If you didn't on the first time when you're drawing to modify that curve. So that's an option that you could maybe explore, and I mean certainly you can further adjust that curve in any way that you like freehand. Certainly it's an option worth exploring and maybe experimenting with to see if it helps you to get the results that you want to get. So that option just below it as well, smooth the curve values. If you click on that, it's just going to smooth out perhaps the strong edges or points that you've maybe made that aren't quite working. So if I just click on that after making that very strong curve, you can see it just smooths out that freehand curve that I've drawn by hand. So I mean that's a tool that would certainly be useful in conjunction with that freehand drawing method of creating your curve. Again, moving back to those control points are going to give you very specific ways to control the curve and how it looks and how it performs. So back to the beginning of our image editing, back to the original image that we started with. You can see that Curves has an incredible amount of flexibility and potential for adjusting your images in Photoshop. Not only, as I mentioned early in the piece, not only from a contrast and density perspective, but also from a color perspective. There's a lot of flexibility there if you really dive deep into the red, green and blue values and the effect that you can have on your image. And it's not just for creating images of reality. There's obviously some really cool tools in there to give you some flexibility on what you produce, how you produce it, and what you achieve as a final result. So definitely in your image editing, it is worth looking at Curves as an option to edit your images to achieve the results that you're wanting to. Don't be afraid of Curves, particularly if you're using it as an adjustment layer. It's non-destructive and you can't break anything, so it's definitely worth just getting in there and experimenting and really starting to dive deep into what it can do for you and your image editing. Hope this video has been helpful. Look forward to seeing you again in the future, and as always, any questions or topics that you would like covered, please leave it in the comments, and look forward to seeing you stop by in the future. Thanks again and take care.